Hey, take your Bibles, open up with me to Psalm 90 this morning. Psalm 90. And there's some pretty cool psalms in the Bible, and this is one of them. It's also a psalm, the only psalm in the Bible that is recorded to have been written by not David, but by Moses, okay? And that's significant because just by way of reminder, Moses spent 40 years in Pharaoh's household. He spent 40 years in the wilderness with sheep, and then he spent 40 years with 2.5 million people who loved to do nothing more than complain, okay? And you might think, man, like that's a serious downgrade. Like you went from Pharaohs to the sheep. At least the sheep didn't complain all the time, right? And then he ended up with another 40 years of ministry with the Israelites in the wilderness while they complained to him most of the time. In fact, they kind of had this reoccurring chorus. It'd be better off if we'd have been in Egypt than to come into the wilderness and die, okay? So that was kind of it. That doesn't sound very optimistic, but that's kind of the approach you get when you're reading the Old Testament. And that's how we find the life of Moses. And that's what makes today's discussion in Psalm 90 so cool and incredible. So just follow with me, if you will. I'm just going to read the first couple verses, and then we're just going to kind of take it section by section. Psalm 90, verse 1. Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. Let me just give you, if I could, 3 guiding principles about time, God, and you, okay? So this is a passage that's about time. It's about the brevity of our life. It's about the eternality of God, and it's about how we perceive our responsibilities with time. So here's the first 3 principles, and we're just going to take them one by one. The first one is this: because God is eternal, your security can always be found in him, okay? The text says, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. Because God is eternal, your security can always be found in him. Here's the second one. Because your lifespan is exceedingly brief, you ought to pay attention to your use of time, okay? How many people do I have here who are in their 20s today? Can I see your hands real quick? Okay, a number of you. You don't think presently that your lifetime is exceedingly brief. How many people do I have who are 60 to 80 here this morning? Can I see your hands? Okay, how many of you think life is exceedingly brief, 60 to 80-year-olds, okay? Yep, you all kept your hands up, right? Because you're saying, man, my life went fast, okay? That's the testimony of Psalm 90. Here's the third idea. Because time is limited, you'd best develop wisdom, contentment, and joy. And that's found at the end of the psalm, where it says, teach us, satisfy us, make us glad. So because our time is limited, we best develop these 3 aspects. So let's take that first one. Because God is eternal, your security can always be found in him. Now, here's what I want to point out to you from the text. Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. So see it? God is literally our dwelling place. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, your God. Now, here's what you want to know. If God is eternal, there has never been a time that God has not existed, and there will never be a time that he doesn't exist, okay? And what's cool about that, and a real practical implication, is this, that therefore there has never been a time in your life where you could not have reached out to him. And there will never be a time, no matter how difficult life gets, that you cannot reach out to him. You with me? This is not based upon what we want or what we feel. This is based upon the eternality of God. From everlasting to everlasting, you are God. Now, one of the cool things about God and time, and so I'm just going to kind of talk science, which I know nothing about, but I'm going to act like I do for just a minute here, okay? Wayne Grudem says that the study of physics tells us that matter, time, and space must all occur together. If there is no matter, there can be no space or time either. Therefore, when God created the universe, he also created time, okay? But the Bible just said from everlasting, that is before time existed, to everlasting. After time exists as we know it, God is still existing, okay? We tend to think that these are Albert Einstein's discoveries. They're not. I read recently that Albert Einstein used to describe the theory of relativity, particularly as it relates to time, in this way. He said, of course time is relative. Take a young man who sees a really pretty girl and set him on the park bench with a girl he'd like to spend time with, and it will seem to him like 60 minutes went for 60 seconds, right? Take that same young man and put him on a hot stove, and it will seem like 60 seconds went for 60 minutes, right? Because he said time is relative, right? But here's what I love. Not that. I love what God said about these 3 elements. You with me? We tend to think that this idea of time, space, and matter occurring together and having to be together is like a recent find, like, I don't know, 1905 or something like that. But 3,500 years ago, I want to show you that these three elements, even before man had discovered them, were already recorded. Time, space, and matter got to come together. Are you with me? I want you to say this verse after me because you already know it. Here we go. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Just say that. In the beginning, watch this. First 8 words of your Bible. In the beginning, time. God created the heavens, space, and the earth, matter. Like, is that really cool or what? We think Einstein found that stuff. He didn't find that stuff. God said 3,500 years ago through Moses, the very first words that God spoke to mankind in this way, he said, in the beginning, that's time. God created the heavens, that's space, and the earth, that's matter. God brought all of those elements together. But God exists outside of those elements, and that is why wherever you go, whenever you go there, God is always available to you. Why? Because God is eternal. Your security can always be found in Him. Now look back at that Psalm 90, verse 1. See it again? Lord, you have been our dwelling place. Just let your eye drift over to Psalm 91, verse 1. He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will abide in the shadow of the Almighty, literally the protection of God. Look down at verse 9 of Psalm 91. Because you have made the Lord your dwelling place, the Most High who is my refuge, no evil shall be allowed to befall you, no plague come near your tent. That's great, isn't it? It's this great reminder that wherever you are, in whatever situation you're in, God will be your dwelling place. Why? Because from everlasting to everlasting, He is God. Okay? There's never a time that He didn't exist, and there will never be a time that He ceases to exist. Here's your second idea. Second idea looks like this. Because your lifespan is exceedingly brief, you ought to pay attention to your use of time. Now, God is eternal, right? No beginning, no ending. But we started, and physically, we will all die at some point. So look with me at verses 3 through 11. Just let me read them to you. You return man to dust, and say, return, O children of man, or literally, man there is the word Adam. That's the word from the dirt. Man was made. God took the dirt and put it together and breathed the breath of life into man. So there it is, children of Adam. For 1,000 years in your sight are but as yesterday when it is past, or as a watch in the night. You sweep them away as with a flood. They are like a dream, like grass that is renewed in the morning. In the morning it flourishes and is renewed, and in the evening it fades and withers. Verse 7. For we are brought to an end by your anger. By your wrath we are dismayed. You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your presence. For all our days pass away under your wrath, and we bring our years to an end like a sigh. The years of life are 70, or even by reason of strength 80, yet their span is but toil and trouble. They are soon gone, and we fly away. Who considers the power of your anger and your wrath according to the fear of you? Now let me stop there for a second. Remember that Moses is writing this psalm back in the time when the Israelites were living in the wilderness. They basically had 40 years to live and die in the wilderness because they had come to Kadesh Barnea, said, we can't go into the promised land because the giants are too big, and there's really nice grapes up there, but we're not going to get up there because we're scared of the giants. And God said to Moses, listen, this whole generation will die off. And so all of this reference to God expressing that He is wrathful or He is angry, the people of Israel would have known that. But just let me clarify something for all of us here today, okay? We're not living in that time where God said, listen, you will not go forward, you will not go into the promised land because of what happened. Instead, just let me express something else to you if I could. Look with me at verse 12. Verse 14. See where it says, satisfy us in the morning with your steadfast love. I've written in the margin of my Bible, this is God's what I call continuity. God's righteous judgment and steadfast love are not contradictions. They work together in some way. I don't understand how they work together. God's steadfast love and His righteous judgment work together in some way, but they do. So when you're reading that portion, you want to focus on the fact that this is who God is in His righteous judgment, but remember, your lifespan is exceedingly brief, so you better pay attention to your use of time. Okay? And just let me point that out to you in 4 ways. Here they are. Life is fragile, life is short, your choices matter, death is certain. okay? These aren't on the notes anywhere, so you better either memorize them or write them down. Here we go. Life is fragile. Life is short. Your choices matter. Death is certain. Life is fragile. Do you see it up there? You return man to dust. I already mentioned to you that the Bible teaches that man was formed out of the dirt or the dust of the earth. Right? Next time you dust your home, okay, as you wipe that cloth across the furniture, just think of your lifespan. Whoosh, gone just like that. Okay? You say, well, I don't like that feeling very much, Phil, which explains why I never dust my house. Okay? I don't know. I just want to tell you that that is who you are. Take the dust off the countertop, blow it off your hand. Okay? Life is fragile. You watch the dust kind of dissipate, it's gone. We live in South Jersey, right? So you know this, that, man, when it gets to be summer, at least where we live, I can't get out of my house without having to dodge roadkill all the way to work. Okay? It's like, maybe it's just because I'm getting older, but as I drive by possums and raccoons and all this other stuff, my mind is just saying, you know, that possum wasn't there yesterday. Okay? He got up this morning and just went about doing what possums do, right? And yet he's lifeless because life is fragile. Life is fragile. Not only is life fragile, but life is short. See it? Verse 4, for 1,000 years in your sight are but yesterday when it's past. 1,000 years, Peter said, to God is like a day. Moses wrote this 3,500 years earlier. You with me? Let's see, that's like 3.5 days. Okay. We think of 3,500 years as a very long period of time. God says, well, that's about 3.5 days in light of eternity. Just try to get your head around that. 1,000 years in your sight is as a day. And how short is life? You and I are like the grass that springs up in the morning, and by the nighttime, it's already yellowing and withering. Okay? That's the picture. Life is fragile. Life is short. Your choices matter. Ooh, this is convicting. Look at verse 8. You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your presence. You thought the sin was secret. You thought you only committed it before yourself and no one else. You thought the room was dark and no one was watching. Hebrews 4:12 communicates it this way: for all of us are naked and exposed before the eyes of him to whom we must give an account. In other words, we think our sins are secret, but even those choices matter, right? Even those choices matter. Life is short. Life is fragile. Your choices matter. Notice the last part. So teach us to number our days. Why? Because up in verse 10, it says, the years of our life are 70, or even by reason of strength, 80. Yet their span is but toil and trouble. My mom and dad used to have on their refrigerator this little cartoon of this decrepit older man sitting on the doctor's physician table. And he's all bent over and he's all worn out. And the doctor says to him, and the caption said, the doctor saying to the old man worn out on the physician's table, remember the 20 years they promised you for healthy living? These are they. Okay? Right? As if to say, if you make it to 70 or 80, even in your strength, watch out, because you need to know that there comes a time when death is certain. Death is certain. The one thing we know about everybody in this room is that we all will experience that. You say, Phil, that's making me really nervous. That's why you want to make sure that you have made a decision to trust Christ who died in your place, so that upon your physical death, you can be, as Psalm 16 says, in your presence, Lord, there are pleasures forevermore, right? You and I can know the joy of heaven. I had an opportunity this past week to experience the way I see time and the way that God sees time. Okay? So I was, for a portion of this week, with all the other things that were going on, I was on the phone with my cell phone provider, who will remain nameless, okay? And I was transferred, like, just a minute, we're going to get somebody that can help you with that. I'd get transferred, and the person would say to me, hello, Mr. Moser, can I help you with something? And I'd say, I told I was supposed to be transferred. Oh, yes. Well, can you give us the last 4 digits of your Social Security number? And I said, everybody's been telling me this, we really apologize. Let me transfer you. And that process went on like 5 times. So I was glad that in my phone records, it doesn't say Pastor Phil Moser, okay? Because like I was losing my sanctification early in the morning, and by the time I got to the afternoon, and now I'm back in a phone call with them again, I'm like, man, I had some sins to repent from here, okay? Here's the thing. Earlier that day, the night before, I got in a text from a family in our church who said, Pastor Phil, would you consider visiting my father-in-law? Because he's ill in the hospital, he's got some procedures this morning, and he fears death. Right? And so, because I knew that there were some procedures coming up, I worked my day so that I could get over to Jefferson Hospital and see this man. Okay? And while I'm heading over there, I think to myself, I'm going to put my phone on speakerphone, I'm going to try this thing with my cell phone provider one more time. And you know what happened? For 55 minutes, that's right, Mr. Moser, just let us transfer you to somebody else, okay? We're going to fix this problem. Stay with us. Oh, I should have been able to fix it, but for some reason, my computer won't let me fix it, okay? And I was saying things like, I don't really think that's my problem. We know it's not your problem. We really apologize. Let me transfer you. Hello, is this Mr. Moser? Yes, this is Mr. Moser, okay? Would you like the last 4 digits of my social security number? Okay. That's where my day was. Okay. I pulled into the parking garage at Jefferson, and I remember thinking, she said, if you can just hold on. I said, ma'am, I have a meeting I have to be at. So if I lose contact, I lost contact. And as I'm walking into the hospital, I say, okay, it's been 55 minutes. I can't wait any longer. I need to see this gentleman. I shut my phone off. And I say to the Lord, Lord, I am in no emotional condition to talk to a man now. Right? And it's like God said, just share the gospel, for crying out loud. Can't you do that? So I walked into his room. We talked a while. He shared what he was afraid of. Right? Talked about the procedure a little bit. It was a really special meeting. I sensed that almost the moment I was in the room. Attentive. He was laying back in his bed. I said, you mind if I share something with you? He said, sure. I started to share the gospel. Right? And I just watched as the closer I got to the end of the story, tears began to form, right? I said, would you like to trust Christ today? And I remember what happened. The man had not sat up the entire time because he's been in some procedures and he was weak. He just sat right up in bed and said, yes, I would, right? I remember thinking, wow, I was thinking about minutes and time and what a hassle something was, as if it was 55 minutes, right? And suddenly I have left the way I think about time, and I'm in a world the way that God thinks about time. Right? For all eternity, this conversation matters. Listen, my cell phone coverage doesn't matter for all of eternity, right? So I remember as I prayed with him and he received Christ, and I'm walking out, I'm smiling to myself, and I'm thinking, as I go down the elevator, I'm thinking, I came into this hospital complaining, and I'm leaving this hospital repenting. Why? Because time for God is very different than it is for us. And what you and I need to learn to do is to remember this lifespan's exceedingly brief. You can spend your time like the Old Testament Israelites complaining about it, okay? Or you can say, what would God have me do with the time that I have? Here's your last thought. Here it is this morning. Because time is limited, you'd best develop wisdom, contentment, and joy. And I love it whenever the Bible does this because it makes it simple to see. Just look with me down at verse 12 and watch. In fact, I'll show it to you on the screen. Look at this. See the similarity to these phrases? Teach us, satisfy us, make us glad. Okay? Teach us, satisfy us, make us glad. That gives us 3 words that are critical: wisdom, contentment, and joy. And you can't really have a discussion about how short your life is without tapping, according to Psalm 90, these 3 words: wisdom, contentment, and joy. So here they are. Teach us to number our days that we may get a heart of wisdom. Wisdom applies, contentment matures, joy focuses. Here it is. Wisdom applies past failures to future exploits. That's what wisdom is, really. Wisdom saying, I tried that in the past, and that's how it failed, and so now I know how to do it differently in the future. You do this every day, whether you realize it or not. You drive a certain way, you say, man, there's a lot of traffic up there. I'm never going to that location again that way, right? I'm going to try my GPS, and then you try your GPS, and then you say, man, I'm never trusting my GPS again, right? Why? Because your wisdom is applying what you learned from the past, and you're doing something different. That's what wisdom is. Wherever your challenges were, whatever your failures were in the past, it's not that you've lived a perfect life. It's that you're applying your failures from the past to your future exploits that God wants you to do so that you don't make the same error again. And what this passage says is, listen, you better get wisdom together because life is short, life is brief, and your time is limited. So don't just kind of coast through life doing whatever you want to do. Why? Because wisdom applies past failures to future exploits. Teach us to number our days. By the way, this is great. The Hebrew stem here is in the Hiphil stem, which is a causal idea. This is a really cool idea if you're a teacher, right? You know what the Hebrew word for teach is? It literally means, it's the word learn, but with this stem that says cause. A teacher causes someone to learn. Right? A teacher doesn't stand up there and just expound information and then say it's the student's problem. A teacher has the way to cause a person to learn. It's a causal word. That's what it is here. Lord, cause us to learn. Cause us to number our days. We don't often number our days. We presume upon them. Right? And then all of a sudden you get a call from a doctor and you're not presuming anymore. You're starting to number them. Right? We would do better to number our days than presume upon our days. Why? Because wisdom applies past failures to future exploits. Here's the second idea. Contentment matures as it dwells upon God's steadfast love. Look with me. See where it said teach us? Now look at satisfy us. Satisfy us in the morning with your steadfast love. Satisfy literally means, that's the word contentment, right? I'm fully satisfied. I'm fully satisfied. I'm content. So what am I to be satisfied with in the text? God's steadfast love. Now, we talked about this before. This is a great Hebrew word. It's the word that the King James translated as loving kindness. It's God's love, literally in action. It's the fact that God just doesn't love. He does something to show his love. He just doesn't say, oh, I love you. He engages in ways to show us his love. And that's what he did with Joseph when Joseph was in prison. He was with Joseph, but he also showed him his steadfast love. Here's what you got to know. Your contentment isn't going to come from any of the circumstances that are around you. The circumstances that are around you, difficult, great, or indifferent, are to drive you to depend and discover the steadfast love of God. And when you do that, here's what happens. Your contentment matures. Right? You stop complaining. Wow. You do understand, don't you, that someday all of us will reach 70 or 80 or 90, and we will get ready to die? And we will either have a life that was lived with contentment, or we'll have a life that was lived with complaining. Okay? Which path are you on? Which path are you on? You say, well, I'm going to fix that tomorrow. I'm going to stop complaining tomorrow. Right now, I got a problem with my cell phone coverage, and I want to complain. Okay? And I want to tell you, you can do that today, okay? And you think you're going to change tomorrow? You're not thinking about time properly. Time is limited. You best develop wisdom, contentment, and joy today. Today, not tomorrow. Here's the last idea. Joy focuses on the work that God is doing in you and through you. Joy focuses on the work that God is doing in you and through you. Now, this is almost humorous. Look at verse 15. Make us glad for as many days as you have afflicted us. Okay? Like, those things don't go together in our mind, do they? Make us glad for as many days as you have afflicted us, and for as many years as we have seen evil. Okay? You say, how can I be glad with that? Because through the affliction, God is working in you. And through the affliction, God is working through you to help somebody else. And that's how the psalm ends. Watch it. Let your work be shown, verse 16, to your servants, and your glorious power to their children. Here it comes. Let the favor of the Lord our God be upon us, and establish the work of our hands upon us. Yes, establish the work of our hands. God is working in you and through you. And Joy just says, listen, that's where my focus is going to be. I love that because, that reminds me of that passage over in John 3 where the disciples asked John the Baptist, hey, John the Baptist, listen, are you okay with this? Jesus' disciples are baptizing, and our people are leaving, and they're going over there. And remember what John said to them? John said, and this my joy has been made full. What? All the people are leaving your ministry and they're going after Jesus' ministry. And this my joy has been made full. He must increase, John 3:30, and I must decrease. John the Baptist found joy. Why? Because God was working in him and through him. It wasn't about the circumstances. And that's why, even in affliction, you and I can choose joy. I want to give a word with joy that you may not have thought about. I think we need to develop what I'm going to call a disciplined joy. Right? We're not. We have a circumstantial joy. But here, we're reading that even in our affliction, we want God to make us glad or make us joyful. Therefore, we should come to what I call a disciplined joy. We start the morning saying, Lord, it may be a hard day, but I want you to make me joyful today. In fact, this also is a great Hebrew stem. It's in the Piel stem, which means here it means it's intensive. It doesn't mean it's causal. It means it's intensive. Like if a glass is broken, that's one thing. But if a glass is broken to smithereens, that's the Piel stem, right? I grew up in a little church in Indiana where every year we would raise missionary funds in like this little acorn bank. It was a little plaster Paris bank, and we would keep our change in there. And one day we had a chance to go up in front of the entire Sunday school. So there'd be like, 100 kids out there. And they would call our name, and we would walk up with our little bank, and we would put it on the table, and we'd take a hammer, and we'd smash it, right? And I remember that I always loved the way Eric smashed it. He smashed it in the Piel stem. He took that hammer, and he drove it, and drove it, and drove it, and pieces are flying all over the place. And whenever we would do the acorn bank, my mom and dad would remind me, listen, just tap the bank, okay? And I wanted to say, I'm 11 years old, for crying out loud. Let me hit the bank. Why? Because I wanted to smash the bank intensively. Now let's just take that word and apply it. Are you asking God, Lord, intensify my joy? Right? Don't just make me joyful. I want you to intensify whatever you're doing in my life to make me glad and joyful even in the midst of my affliction. I want to remind you that is the most beautiful picture, one of the most beautiful pictures Christians can give. That in their affliction, they are not complaining, but they are content and joyful. You know why? Because they know that the time is running out for them to have wisdom, contentment, and joy.